This episode is presented by Brex, the financial stack founders can bank on. Learn more at brex.com/TechCrunch24.
Hello and welcome to Found. Today we're bringing you a fun bonus conversation from backstage at this year's TechCrunch Disrupt. TechCrunch's climate expert Tim Deschamps talked with Areeb Malik, the co-founder and CTO of Glacier, Allison Wolf, the co-founder and CEO of Vibrant Planet, both of which are companies you may be familiar with from past Found episodes, in addition to Hook-Yan Su, the co-founder of VenX and general partner at Sky River Ventures. On stage, the panel discussed how a startup can balance doing good with delivering the financial returns they need to keep their investors happy and keep their own lights on. They continued that conversation backstage for this bonus episode. To watch the full on-stage panel, check out the link in our bio. Otherwise, we hope you enjoy and have a happy holidays.
All right, Areeb, one of the things we mentioned or we discussed was this idea of big tech, climate, sustainability. How much do they mean it? How much of it is greenwashing? And the thing that I really wanted to dive into more is, what's the point at which kind of the curtain is opened and we can see whether they're real about it or whether it's greenwashing?
You know, when I was working at one of these big tech companies, it became very apparent to me that there are plenty of people, in fact, most people at these companies do care about these problems. But the way these companies are built, and any company is built, is it's about making money. It's about growing your business, feeding your shareholders, etc. And so while you might have good intentions, ultimately, like, the business needs to survive and needs to thrive. And that always takes priority. Now, that doesn't mean as a big company you can't do good things. I can definitely point to many examples of my time in big tech where those good things were happening. And I was actually part of a lot of those movements. But at the end of the day, right, if things get tight, if revenue is squeeze, you're going to see the secondary initiatives get dropped. And the primary ones are going to stay. And the primary initiative at a company is always to make money. It's really, at this point, if we want to create the change we want, it's about aligning that money making with the impact you want to make. How do you peel back the curtains? I mean, you're not going to see it. You just need to know that the folks who work at these places, they're folks like me, right? I used to be at this and I still cared a ton about these problems, but it wasn't my day job. It wasn't my primary focus. And so there are people there, but the incentives maybe aren't aligned for them to make the impact that I think we all hope to see.
Yeah, and Allison, you spent time working with a lot of these companies. Like, what was your perspective there? Like, how do we unpack this? And is there kind of a particular moment where companies change and they start dropping these initiatives? Or is it just kind of a slow bleeding like we see with kind of these constant layoffs?
So Areeb is right to some extent. I think until we change shareholder expectations and until we have more regulation, like what we're seeing with the new SEC rules, where it's compensatory to manage for climate risk, and the CSRD in Europe, which is going into law in 2025. I mean, I think we do need legal frameworks that change what companies value and what they are managing for. But in the meantime, what we've seen over the last couple of decades is where cost savings meet green. And so a lot of what I was involved in Silicon Valley over years was sort of creating a space race for who could have the most efficient data center, sort of playing to the male egos, sorry guys, to, create a competitiveness around that, and then helped Facebook launch the Open Compute Foundation, where those concepts actually lived and were shared openly so that other people could replicate. Similarly, did the same thing with renewable energy, and especially as renewable energy did become cheaper than fossil fuels, renewable energy made a lot of sense. And so building coalitions again and sort of a competitive space race in renewable energy buying, where we would go into coal-based states like Kentucky and Texas and say, we're going to bring this many jobs, this much philanthropy, we're going to build some data centers, and we're going to add some wind and solar to the grid. And that played a big role in the tipping point on fossil fuels becoming more expensive than renewable energy. So that's what we can do now. I think where companies have held back is on policy change. I was really fortunate to work at both Google and Facebook with Bill Weil, who's a known leader in the sustainability space. And he left Facebook because out of a little bit of frustration where you can only go so far with what you can do internally on things like data center efficiency and renewable energy buying, where companies really need to think about stepping up is policy change. And that takes a lot of guts.
Yeah. Hyuk-Jin, you mentioned something like that similarly when we were on stage about the AI race and this kind of thirst for power. How much of that do you think is going to drive the next wave of change in energy markets, in the startups that come out of this? I mean, already we've seen investments from Microsoft, Google, Amazon in fusion, in fission, and other things like that. But obviously we have near-term solutions too. So how do you think that's going to play out in kind of this power crunch around AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think AI is definitely fueling the market in terms of alternative sources of energy and technology, and it's having this second derivative impact in all industries, right? You can imagine because of the need for AI, there's a tremendous amount of energy storage that's needed. There's also a tremendous amount of next-gen semiconductor and memory that is needed to keep up with that pace. That also requires next-gen super high-speed fiber optics and other types of technologies that are needed. So there are just so many kind of ripple effects that are happening. And because of that, I think the world will change quite drastically over the coming years. So when you think about people wanting to do good and changing the world, we generally all, I think, want to do that. But without a sustainable way of generating money and profit, a lot of these companies are hamstrung. They can't really do it, even though if they wanted to. So having this other motive that has this ripple effect is, I think, the way these new technologies are going to be implemented and progress.
More from this conversation right after a quick break.
This episode is presented by Brex, the financial stack founders can bank on. Brex knows cash is king for startups, so they built a banking experience that takes every dollar further. Unlike traditional business banking solutions, Brex has no minimums and no transaction fees, and you can get 20 times the standard FDIC protection. Even better, you can earn industry-leading yields from your first dollar while still being able to access your funds anytime. Get the business account trusted by 1 in 3 U.S. startups at brex.com/techcrunch24.
I wanted to also talk a little bit about your time at Samsung Ventures, if we could, because you were kind of in a somewhat internal role, but with like a little bit of arm's length, but still thinking about the company's goals in mind. So what was that interaction like, since you did have a little bit of distance and some discretion, but you were still ultimately within Samsung?
Yeah, and people behave differently, right? You have your own core philosophy of how you're going to do investments and how you interact with startups and things like that. My overall philosophy was that we need to help startup companies survive and thrive. And by doing that, they actually create next-gen products and technologies and IP, which then helps the corporates, such as Samsung, to implement that and scale it up so that it is widely adoptable around the world. But if the corporation itself tries to say, okay, we want this for ourselves and provide exclusivity, then it does kind of hamper the growth of that startup company, and ultimately it may kill the company. Then we're back to where we were from stage one, right? So I think having that vision of saying, okay, we're going to help this company, but there has to be some incentive on the Samsung side to adopt that. And so it's a very fine balance. That was the core crux of what Samsung Ventures was trying to do, is how can we help startup companies, but also help our mothership a little bit, but make sure we don't kill the goose that laid the golden egg, right?
Yeah.
I'll just jump in because I think it's a really good point that there are opportunities for these large companies, Samsungs, the Googles, the Amazons of the world. They want to do something good for the planet, and they just need the company to exist so they can actually jump on top of it, because they're not going to R&D that themselves. So as a founder, like, there's a really cool opportunity to know what the desired output is and then build towards it so that it's really easy to adopt, and you get a strong market right like that.
Do you think that gave you an edge, Areeb, when you were founding Glacier, that you kind of knew what these big companies wanted, what their motivations were?
Definitely. I think knowing how a large company operates makes it very clear what you need to do to get them to want a new technology. And having that insight, it's one of the reasons actually we partner with Amazon, who is very much a big company, and like people see them as like a big polluter as well. They create a lot of stuff, but the people inside, like, they do want to do well for the planet. So knowing how they think, knowing what they would spend on, knowing what sort of technology they would adopt was really helpful to designing our product, our AI, our offerings, so that we can actually get that adoption. Because at the end of the day, right, like, we're trying to not just, become a large company ourselves, but sway all these other large players, and knowing how they think and work is definitely a benefit.
Yeah, at my fund at Skyrim Ventures, one of the things we try to do is we try to understand the needs of the corporates. Like, what are the challenges that they're facing? And by knowing that and having regular discussions with various corporates, we kind of understand what the market trends are like. And then we try to work backwards and find startup companies that can fulfill the need of each of these corporates. that accelerates the partnership and the POCs and the commercial launches much quicker than just randomly investing in companies. So our philosophy is a little bit different because of our experiences being at these companies and understanding the bureaucracy, the timeline, and where it's going to bog things down, and preparing the startup companies to brace for that, right? And it's not that the corporates don't want to move faster. There are these milestones that they must hit, or there's these reportings they have to do, or there are these optical, metrics that they have to show to the executives. And so we have to help them with that. And not all venture capital funds understand this, and not all people can help with that. But that's where I think our fund is a little bit different in trying to say, hey, this company has met with you and they've now gone radio silent for months. Why is that? A lot of startups panic, like they're stealing our IP, they're doing all these things. But it's that they have to go through this internal process, and understanding that really helps the startup companies and also helps the corporates to be able to say, okay, we can't wait that long. What is your next timeline? And we try to help them out that way.
It's so important to find a champion at these companies because each company operates a little bit differently. If you get someone on your side who knows how the company works, it makes it so much easier to penetrate and get adoption. And the cool thing is in the climate space, like it's so easy to find a champion. So many people want to do something big, but they're stuck in the shackles of these large corporations. And as soon as you meet with them, they're so excited. Like, oh my gosh, you could actually change things. I know how it works on the inside. You bring the tech, we'll form a little partnership, and like good things will happen.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's kind of greased the wheels within a lot of these large corporations is AI. And I think it was kind of like, I don't want to say a cloud, but definitely a subtext to our conversation, which is, again, the enormous power demands and stuff like that. As founders, do you feel kind of hamstrung by this rush to AI, and like what would ease your mind about it, both from a sustainability perspective and an operational perspective?
So for us, AI is core to our very business. So the foundation of our software is a foundational model to map nature to the point where we can actually help with decisions around defensible space. We can see roofing material and things like that to help communities mitigate fire. But then we can also help with permit level decisions and the things that block permits, like species like spotted owl. We can figure out using AI where spotted owls might be living in vegetation, right? So it's core to our whole company. And it's also how we are able to scale across the Western United States and now globally, not an off to the side thing. In terms of, do I feel badly about the energy use? My hope is that our team is pioneering ways to use GPUs and CPUs really efficiently and choosing when we use each to do our work on the foundational model. For us, the trade-off of avoided emissions that are reversing all the progress we're making on climate change, the use of AI and the energy there is worth the trade-off when you're doing really core climate tech work. It's unfortunate, but we have to do it because it's the only way we'll keep a lot of nature intact.
One thing I'd like to say is that, and it's been said that one AI query takes about 100x the more energy than a Google search, right? And a lot of startup companies, I think, feel pressured to become an AI company. And in the early days of AI, I think a lot of the investors were enamored by AI, and so were investing a tremendous amount of money. But a lot of the venture investors are now getting savvy to understand that. And so, but just being a company with an AI wrapper is no longer really of interest to investors. And so those companies ultimately, I don't think will get a whole lot of funding. It's the AI companies that truly have a foundational model, a unique architecture, something that is very unique to them that investors are interested in. So chasing after AI right now, I think is a little bit overrated, and maybe the trains are left the station here a bit.
Yeah. Speaking of funding, climate tech is off its peak, as you mentioned, Hyuk-jin, around $18 billion a few years ago. It is trending up. We're up a little bit from last year, but it's still around $4 billion or so. How hard is it out there as an investor looking for LPs? What's the appetite?
Well, the funny thing is, when I was raising money for Sky River and we're a deep tech focused fund, I had so many LPs ask me, are you a climate fund? Are you a clean tech fund? And while we do investments in those areas, we decided not to say that because we think there's more to global impact and doing good than just doing climate. Investing in healthcare, investing in perhaps education, in automation, all these things do good. It was tempting, but we decided not to do that. And a lot of investors have tremendous interest in investing in climate companies and so on. The challenge is not so much the fundraise. As we saw, there's still an upward trend right now versus last year, but it's the exits. the exits has been really challenging for climate companies. If you look at the valuation of climate companies over the last several years versus just the average valuation of tech companies, the climate companies do have a higher valuation. But when it comes to actual exits, they tend to have a lower valuation. And so the return for the investors who invested in climate in the past several years has not been as fruitful as companies who are investing in other types of tech or AI or consumer or SaaS. And so I think that's a big challenge. And how do investors reason that out as they speak to new LPs, I think is the challenge because the exit side.
Yeah. Areeb and Allison, you have similar approaches, I would say, to climate, right? You are climate tech companies, but you're addressing it in a way that's not maybe explicitly going after carbon like a direct air capture company or something like that. So how has it been out there fundraising as you're looking, right? Because obviously, as Hyuk-Jin said, valuations are down. Investors are maybe getting a little bit stingier as they're looking toward exits. Have you been experiencing similar sort of challenges in the fundraising market?
Well, I think that for us, we never explicitly relied on the fact that we were climate tech to fundraise. We relied on the fact that we're a good business. We relied on the fact that we make money, we have good margins, all the things that actually matter to an investor from a financial perspective. For me personally, the climate angle is core to what we do, but I want to present my business where the climate is kind of a cherry on top, but you're really into it because of the returns, because I think that's what actually attracts. And so if you can position your business like that, I think it makes fundraising a lot easier. That being said, fundraising is always difficult.
In some ways, it's a question of how you pitch.
Definitely. It's all about how you position. Making sure that you understand your investors is really key. And I think, what Hyuk-Jin said is like knowing what the investors want, knowing what their LPs want goes a long way to making sure that you and the investor resonate and they understand that you guys are both partnering on the same mission and nobody's trying to dig at anyone else.
Yeah, Allison, was it a little bit different for you coming from a world that's maybe a little bit more familiar to some investors, being a SaaS company?
Well, for us too, both with our customers and with investors. So we have some hardcore climate tech investors. And so for them, the pitch is the long-term vision of being a nature-based climate solutions company. And that's what they're interested in, and the quantification of how much carbon we can avoid emissions on and how much removal happens with ecosystems like forests. But we are very positioned right now around wildfire risk mitigation. And with wildfires becoming really bad. I mean, last year's smoke from Canada going to the East Coast, this is going to sound really icky, but it was probably the best thing that could have happened for our company because it really woke up not just Washington, D.C., that even for the agencies that manage from D.C. the fire problem, they needed to breathe some smoke too and have the orange sky like we see out here on the West Coast. And similarly, investors on the East Coast really needed to experience that to bring it home. And so right now, sort of like Areeb, we aren't really positioning as a climate tech company unless that is directly relevant to an investor. We're playing hard to the collapse of insurance and the risk mitigation that has to be done before we lose trillions of assets.
One thing I say to a lot of the companies in hard tech, capital intensive technologies, or climate tech, whatever, is that a lot of them seek VCs to help them save their company. And I tell them oftentimes VCs aren't there to save your company. A lot of times they're there, to be honest, to ride the coattails of successful companies and put more fuel to the fire to help them really accelerate. And so one of the things I tell VCs, and I may be shooting myself in the foot here, and I tell them, don't come and look for funding from me if you don't need money from me. In fact, go and find alternative non-dilutive financing, grants, and all of that to really develop the technology as much as you can before you raise funding from VCs. Stay in a research lab at a university, stay in a national research facility, whatever, and just raise that NSF grant, raise whatever grants you can. And then when you're really ready to commercialize, really able to take this out to the market and accelerate quickly, then go and find funding from VCs. And they'll be far more likely to invest in you when they see that trajectory and growth that you've already built.
Yeah. And Hyuk-Jin, one last question here. You mentioned that we're probably going to see IPO or exit window open up in 2025. What sorts of sectors and companies do you think are going to be entering that window first?
Companies typically, when they do go public, they do have to show a line of sight to regular sources of revenue with profitability And so I do think a little bit challenging for climate companies. I do see that being a little bit challenging, but I think we'll probably open up the market more in the enterprise SaaS space would be my guess. A lot of these AI companies might want to go public, and maybe a few, such as OpenAI and others, but I think for the most, it will be in the SaaS play would be my guess for the initial.
Including within climate tech, see some more SaaS.
I think so, yeah.
Thanks so much for being here, everyone.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Found is hosted by myself, TechCrunch senior reporter Becca Skutak, alongside senior reporter Dominic Midori Davis. Found is produced by Maggie Stamets with editing by Kel. Our illustrator is Bryce Durbin. Found's audience development and social media is managed by Morgan Little, Alyssa Stringer, and Natalie Kreisman. TechCrunch's audio products are managed by Henry Pickavet. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week.